Understand the business. In every institution, information is blood. Bradley H. Patterson, Jr., The Ring of Power. Before thoroughly digging into a business analytically, I usually ask straightforward questions about the business and its past, present, and future. There is nothing mystical about this. It's just a way to uncover what does not instantly meet the eye. You will find the complete list of my questions in Chapter 6. In his wonderful checklist manifesto, The American Surgeon and writer Atul Gawande rates checklists as among the basic tools of the quality and productivity in virtually every field. Combining high risk and complexity. Checklists seem lowly and simplistic, but they help fill in for the gaps in our brains and between our brains. I learned a long time ago that having a checklist of questions saves you time and puts you into a mindset primed to pick up on relevant strengths and weaknesses. It may also help you confirm or refute any judgments you have already made. I, for one, came into the company with knowledge of one massive and obvious problem. Phoenix had succeeded for decades as a smallish, $90 million, company and was then sold to sponsor or private equity ownership which agglomerated it into a $700 million-plus company. The rub? It was still being run with systems designed for the original $90 million company. The company's grossly underpowered processes were driving nothing more or less than chaos. Grab hold of the Stockdale paradox. The late Admiral Jim Stockdale was the highest-ranking U.S. military officer held as a POW during the Vietnam War. He was beaten and tortured some 20 times during his captivity from 1965 to 1973. He had no reason to believe he would live to see home and freedom again, but he nevertheless took command of his fellow POWs to lead them in a way that would exponentially increase their chances of survival. Years after the war, good to great author Jim Collins had an opportunity to speak with Stockdale. He asked him how he got through his long ordeal alive and unbroken. I never doubted not only that I would get out, Stockdale told Collins, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life, which, in retrospect, I would not trade. Rendered all but speechless by Stockdale's response, Collins asked, who didn't make it out? Oh, that's easy. The optimists. Naturally, Collins was puzzled, but Stockdale explained that the optimists were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come, and Christmas would go. Then they'd say, we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come, and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart. The lesson Stockdale took from this is that you must never lose your confidence that you will ultimately prevail, but you must never let this belief cause you to abandon the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. Today, this is called the Stockdale paradox. How do you remain disciplined? Through process. Stockdale gave his fellow prisoners processes for prevailing, getting through torture, secretly communicating with one another, and other procedures and routines. If process can mean the difference between rational hope and darkest despair, if it can mean the difference between living and dying under the worst conditions imaginable, it can certainly guide you to success in managing even the most challenging business situations. I asked the questions about past performance and discovered there had been no growth before 2016, when one of the former private equity firms bought it. Up to that time, every Company added to Phoenix performed worse than at the time of acquisition. I dug deeper into this and found a story that clarified the problem and pointed to a solution. You must always assume that the answers are out there. Ask the right people. If you don't know who the right people are, ask whomever you can. Even if they may be the wrong people, they should be able to suggest somebody with the answers. The failure to get answers usually begins with a failure to ask questions. Obvious, but no less true. Ponder the answers and make decisions. Hands off though they wanted to be, my employer was a supremely diligent steward of its companies. It wanted to know why the performance of the acquisition declined once the company had been acquired. Management set out to get the answer and discovered it was twofold. First, the previous owner of Phoenix had been functioning as an absentee CEO, spending most of his time away from the company. Second, there was no discernible growth strategy during their tenure, well, no strategy except acquisition, which can be more of a reflex than a strategy. Armed with this answer, the firm acted on it, moving the previous owner out of the CEO role. The search for a new CEO began, during which, some 18 months, the Phoenix company experienced the full force of the pandemic, shut down a bunch of facilities, laid off many people, and started combining assets. When I discovered this, I had the answer to several questions I always ask when I come in to lead a company. The attempt to restore growth by reducing costs through non-strategically shedding assets, including human capital, is a common response to decline. However, when done strategically, cuts, like skillful surgery, can be life-saving and even life-restoring. When cuts are made across the board, willy-nilly, I have never known them to work, and wherever I see this behavior, I know that I am staring at a bright red flag. A company attempting to cut its way to profitability only gets into deeper trouble as management is hollowed out. A chainsaw is not an instrument of strategy. There is such a thing as a strategic layoff. But when layoffs become a mere reflex, there is no strategy. It is a response aimed at outlays without regard to revenue. You cannot save the village by destroying it. You might conclude that when I was finally brought on as Phoenix's CEO in 2021, I didn't need to do much evaluation. Most of the causes of damage were in plain sight. But the truth is that when something is bad enough to look obviously wrong, what you are not seeing in plain sight is usually even worse. This, that, and this are wrong. So, stop doing this, that, and this. They were all obvious problems that seemed, to me, at least, eminently fixable. Besides, one of the factors that motivated me to take the job was my familiarity with many of the distributors that amalgamated into Phoenix. So, I figured that, underneath all the mess, we had great products, exclusivity in key territories, and a lot of good people on our team. This makes for a strong reoccurring revenue stream. In other words, the fundamentals were there. There was nothing wrong with Phoenix that couldn't be fixed. I think I can turn it around, I said aloud. The truth is that I didn't realize just how much trouble Phoenix was in when I accepted the role of CEO. Maybe that was because so many problems were so evident that I stopped looking for more, including more sources of difficulty. At the same time, I had not recognized all the opportunities. It's not that the obvious answers are wrong, it's just that they may not be the only answers. You don't need a microscope, but you do need to get on the ground. I was named CEO of Phoenix on August 9, 2021. My first and immediate objective was to understand the business thoroughly. To do this, I had to 1. Identify obvious and pressing problems and fix them. 2. Analyze the business. 3. Understand the current strategy and modify it to align with business objectives. Steps 1 and 2 can be most effectively launched by asking the questions I posed at the beginning of this chapter, but never let the analysis get in the way of immediately addressing the most obvious, urgent, and existential problems. Existential problems are those that threaten imminent harm. Almost always, these are issues of revenue. Do first what you must do to stay in business, and buy time to fix everything else. If you let the business die, you have nothing left to fix. Existential problems, existential solutions. If your house is on fire, put out the fire. If your boat has a leak, patch the hole. Take a 3L tour and beyond. You don't need to start with a microscope. In fact, you may never need such an instrument. What is required is an understanding of the business from a ground perspective. When I arrived at Phoenix, I went on a 3L tour, listening, learning, and leveraging. I just went out and started talking to everybody. My first questions are always variations of, what's happening? They boil down to, how's the business? What's working? What's not working? Tell me what you like about your job and what you don't. What's going right and wrong? I find it very helpful to moderate the spontaneity of a 3L tour by circulating in advance a simple list of questions to help people think about what they want to say. With key managers in the organization, I take an even more programmed approach by setting up a series of 3 one-on-one meetings, which are only slightly more formal versions of the 3L tour. The first meeting could be titled, Getting Acquainted. In advance, I send my counterpart in the scheduled interview an easygoing, informal questionnaire. Meeting 1, Getting Acquainted. Getting to know each other on a personal level. Things I would like to know. 1. Tell me about your work and your role. What skills do you bring to your role? 2. What are the most rewarding aspects of your job? 3. Why do you do your job, besides for the paycheck? 4. How can I support you? 5. What brings out the best in you? What are your work preferences and styles? 6. How would you describe the business and what's working or not working? 7. What are you most proud of in this past year? Why? 8. What do you like to do when you're not working? 9. If you could make a request to anyone in the company, what would you ask for? Why? Potential topics you might like to share. 1. What I would like Bill to know about me is. 2. I would describe my own leadership style as. 3. What excites me most about my role is. 4. My single greatest concern is. 5. The 2 things that would help us be more successful are. 6. To get the most out of my performance, it helps to. 7. What requires our immediate attention is. 8. I consider your, Bill's, top 3 priorities to be. I take time to digest the first meeting, in other words, to really get acquainted. When I feel ready, I set up the second set of Onion 1 meetings, which are devoted to discussing the business. Meeting 2, Discussing the business. Let's talk about the business and your role. Topics that will help me learn how the organization works. 1. Business performance, objectives, goals, strategies. Tactics, financials. 2. People and team, how are things working in your area? How do we engage our people? Who are our high performers? What is the level of engagement? 3. Customers. What do customers say about our products? What challenges are we facing in the market? 4. Distributors, vendors, and partnerships. What is our strategy for working with others? Who are considered our strategic partners? 5. Processes. How are the processes enabling or hindering work outputs? 6. Working across the organization. How do you and your team work with other areas? 7. Opportunities and challenges. Provide examples. 8. Support. What support do you need from me, and what other resource requirements do you have? 9. Professional career development. What are your career aspirations? 10. Miscellaneous. What other advice do you have as we move forward? Again, I take the time to study my notes from this meeting before setting up the third round, which is a deeper dive business review. Meeting 3, Deeper Dive Business Review. Opportunity to validate and confirm knowledge about the business and to seek input on next steps. Deeper dive from second meeting as well as the following. 1. Continued discussion of the business and topics raised in meeting 2. 2. Key initiatives in which you are involved. 3. Opportunities and challenges for all parties. 4. Risks the company faces. 5. Resource requirements. 6. Process or system requirements. 7. Talent review of your team. Focus on what is important, both the urgent and the non-urgent, avoid everything else. Based on your 3L tour and meetings with key managers, you are ready to analyze the business. Just don't get too comfortable about it. Your tour and meetings should be sufficient to alert you to issues of obvious urgency. If your house is on fire, put out the fire. If your boat is leaking, patch the holes. Address the existential problems. Develop a bias for action. If something obvious needs fixing, fix it. You can always fine-tune later. If your initial fix is ineffective, try something else. An effective leader learns how to identify high-priority problems quickly and then focus efforts on them. With obvious problems, your objective should be to make a major impact swiftly. Identify your A-item priorities. Get early wins on these, and you will not only address existential problems that threaten the business in the short term, but the early wins you gain will lift morale throughout the organization and inspire confidence in your leadership as well as in what psychologists call the self-efficacy of the company's people, their belief that they possess the knowledge, skill, and competence to solve their problems, leverage their opportunities, and perform their assigned missions. These early wins and self-efficacy attitudes are critical to building valuable momentum to drive the organization to accomplish all strategic goals. A-item priorities bear the following hallmarks. 1. They flow from fundamental problems. 2. They are specific rather than vague or general. 3. They suggest a clear direction but also allow for flexibility, so that actions can be modified to suit a changing situation or fresh information and data about the current and evolving situation. When the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor thrust the United States into World War II on December 7, 1941, U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall summoned Brigadier General Dwight D. Eisenhower to Washington, D.C. There, Marshall quickly summed up the catastrophic situation in the Pacific. The fleet at Pearl Harbor had been smashed, Wake Island was under heavy attack, Guam had fallen, the possessions of U.S. allies Britain and the Netherlands had fallen or were about to fall, and the Philippines, at the time a U.S. Commonwealth territory, was About to be invaded. It was a litany of disaster, and Marshall had one question for Eisenhower: what should be our general course of action? Ike knew there was no feasible fix, but he asked Marshall for a few hours to formulate a reply and returned later that day to lay out what he considered the only immediately viable course: do everything militarily possible, no matter how little, by establishing a base of operations in Australia. The people of China, of the Philippines, of the Dutch East Indies will be watching us. They may excuse failure, but they will not excuse abandonment. This was not a formula for quick victory. Why not? Because quick victory was impossible in this situation. Yet, it was the first step in a process of ultimate victory. Marshall agreed with Ike's proposal and recognized Eisenhower as a leader willing and able to provide realistic and productive responses even to hopeless situations. What was needed at the moment was an alternative to surrender. In other words, what was needed was a first step away from surrender. Marshall understood this and immediately named Eisenhower, hitherto an obscure officer, Assistant Chief of the Army War Plans Division. He was promoted to Major General. In a short time, Eisenhower would become the supreme Allied commander in Europe. He would run the war against Germany and its allies. In his answer to Marshall, Eisenhower put into practice a prioritizing framework he explained years later, in 1954. When he was President of the United States, I have two kinds of problems, President Eisenhower said, the urgent and the important. The urgent are not important, and the important are never urgent. Famed business thinker and author Stephen Covey borrowed Eisenhower's thought process and devised the following action matrix. Urgent, not urgent. I. Manage crisis. Medical emergencies. Pressing problems. Deadline-driven projects. Last-minute preparations. For scheduled activities. 2. Focus. Preparation/planning. Prevention. Values clarification. Exercise. Relationship building. True recreation/relaxation. Quadrant of necessity, quadrant of quality and personal leadership. 3. Avoid interruptions, some calls, some mail and reports, some meetings, many pressing matters, many popular activities. 4. Avoid trivia, busy work, junk mail, some phone messages / email, time wasters, escape activities, viewing mindless TV show, quadrant of deception, quadrant of waste. This matrix will help you to execute a key principle: focus on what is important, both the urgent and the non-urgent. Avoid everything else. The fact is that urgent problems demand attention because the consequences of not addressing them are usually serious and immediate. Yet urgent problems are almost always imposed on you. They embody somebody else's goals, whereas important issues are key to achieving your goals, your strategic ends, even though their consequences might be less immediate. Begin by distinguishing the important from the unimportant. Set the unimportant aside. The urgent and non-urgent are important, but for practical, existential reasons, you must address the urgent first, without forsaking the non-urgent for long. If you know what is important and urgent, you can focus on these issues, while reserving enough time to focus on the non-urgent.